So my talk is going to follow on reasonably well from Mark's because I've been thinking about similar things in terms of my PhD research, which I conducted at Ban Non Wat, which is one of the sites that Mark mentioned. So today's talk will be a kind of culmination of some thoughts about those big models that Mark was talking about and how we might look at them at different sites and how those things might be relevant in characterizing variation. So essentially what I'm going to do today is chat a bit about how bioarchaeological evidence is really contributing to these big models and how we can use those as a springboard for looking at variation within those big scale processes. I'm going to talk a bit about the differences between central areas and peripheral areas, and then talk about how that relates to what we're seeing at Ban Non Wat, where I've been working. So, just a bit of background first. Bioarchaeological evidence at the moment is really awesome because it's really coming to the fore in terms of how we create models and how we feed into models, particularly around the agricultural transition. So Mark was talking earlier about the two-layer hypothesis, which really is built on bioarchaeological evidence of sort of craniometrics, non-metrics, potentially DNA stuff. I don't know if you have that yet. And also bioarchaeological evidence can really feed into what we know about the effects of things like agriculture coming into an area. So we can use it to assess possible demographic transitions. We can use it to show how much agricultural crops were relied upon. And behind that picture there is something to do with how we can use it to look at the health impacts of that transitionary change. And Sean's going to talk about that right after me, so fitting in. And that's really cool because we have these massive scale models of how agriculture moved into an area, how there might be some sort of differences in that process in different areas. And we need to investigate that more, in my opinion, because Southeast Asia is a super diverse area. It's really environmentally diverse. We've got these massive mountains in Myanmar, we've got mangrove forests, we've got crazy karst topography, and people like Joyce White have talked a lot about how this environmental diversity is going to affect the human response to change in an area. So in different places, because you've got different environments, you've got different stuff going on, you're going to get a different response in terms of health, in terms of social behaviour, that kind of thing, to any change. For example, resource use is going to vary massively just depending on what's available in an area. You might not have the impetus to rely on agriculture so much initially. And Sean's going to talk in a sec about how we've been thinking about how these environmental differences are going to cause differences in local disease environments and the pathogens present. And similarly, these kinds of differences in environment mean that some places are more suitable for agriculture than others, some places have physical barriers to movement in them, which means there's going to be variation in contact between populations. And that's kind of what I want to focus in on now. So Mark set up the two-layer hypothesis model a second ago, and the idea that agricultural transition is fundamentally linked to these incoming agriculturalists from China, who then spread out across the Southeast Asian mainland and are spreading the agricultural culture and their own genes with them as they go. And this is super well established in North Vietnam, where they've got all those lines of evidence because they've got complex hunter-gatherer cemeteries that predate the agriculturalists coming in, so you can see that changeover happening. It's less good, as Mark touched upon, for those of us in other areas because we don't have these complex hunter-gatherer cemeteries lying about the place, so we don't have a preceding population that we can compare morphologically with, or we've got rock shelter burials which are more isolated and are not forming a coherent population for us to compare with. So, what do we do in those areas? Well, I think the fundamental thing that I want to get across in my talk is that we consider the fact that there might be variation in how agriculture is spreading in different areas and consider how we can test that on a site-by-site basis. Because of the environmental diversity in Southeast Asia, there is probably going to be different speed and nature of agricultural uptake in different places. So in all of these sort of dynamic diffusion models of people coming into an area, you're going to have an area of central interaction where there's lots of admixture occurring, lots of replacement. Then you're going to have more peripheral areas, and perhaps on the very end of the periphery there, you might not get people moving at all, you might not get genes exchanged, you might just get ideas exchanged. And we don't know whether that's the case in Southeast Asia because, as I said before, it's difficult to test. But having these models in place means that we have an opportunity to test whether agricultural transition and the cultural associated with it is spreading in the same way, and how it's spreading, when it's spreading, and why it's spreading. And that's kind of what I ended up accidentally dealing with in my PhD research at Ban Non Wat. So for those who don't know, Ban Non Wat is quite a well-excavated site in northeast Thailand, up there in the Upper Moon River Valley. It has the earliest Neolithic burials in the area that date to 1750 BC. And some of those burials are interspersed with these flex burials. So these flex burials exist alongside the supine burials at the site through into the Bronze Age. So from the early Neolithic into the Bronze Age, we have these guys dotted about the place. They're quite different to the supine burials that Mark was talking about that are associated with agriculturalists. They're sort of semi-flexed. They're not the same as the hunter-gatherer ones he showed, but they're similar. And they have quite different material culture associated with them. So mortuary offerings that they have include shell species, which aren't seen in the supine burials. They have different types of pottery. So they're a bit weird. And one of the things that I ended up looking at in my PhD was whether these guys could be evidence for a hunter-gatherer population existing alongside the agriculturalists in this area. Which, if that is the case, would be super cool, because then we have a hunter-gatherer population existing in the same place as the supine ones. But maybe they're not hunter-gatherers at all. So how do we find out? Well, one of the things that has been done already is looking at metric variation within the site, comparing the flexed burials to the supine ones in terms of their craniometrics, and seeing whether they have similar affinities. Now, the problem we have at Ban Non Wat, as you can see on this individual here, is that we've got a lot of post-depositional deformation, which means that it's quite difficult to do craniometrics on a big sample size. And that's particularly a problem with the flex burials, because there aren't very many of them anyway. But if you do craniometrics on the ones that are not completely deformed like this one, you find, and I think it was Mark and Hiro who did this work initially, who found that there's essentially no difference craniometrically between these flex burials and the supine ones later at the site. But small sample size. So part of what I did for my PhD was add some more evidence. And my baby is isotopic research, but I also put in some non-metric variation to see whether that could give us some more genetic affinities. So just in brief, I'm not going to go into the detail of how these analyses actually work, but in very basic terms, strontium isotopes relate to your place of origin, and carbon isotopes relate to your diet. If the flex burials are hunter-gatherers, we might reasonably assume them to have a different diet, and also to be from a potentially different area than the later, well, the supine burials, because they could be incoming agriculturalists. And what we find is that that's half right. So in terms of strontium isotopes, the y-axis there, the flex burials, which are our triangles, don't fall outside the realms of what is normal for the supine burials. So we have no evidence for the supine burials being from a different place and being incoming populations. But they are kind of different in terms of diet. So this carbon isotope axis here could relate to multiple things, but it is consistent with a hunter-gatherer diet, more broad-spectrum input, as opposed to these values here, which are a little bit more ricey. The problem that we have with using isotopes, particularly isotopes related to mobility, is that they rely on you having a different geological place of origin. So it is still possible, even having the same isotopic results, that our supine burials came from a different place and moved into the area, because the whole of the Upper Moon River Valley there in green is the same in terms of strontium isotopes, and it's the same as the Sakon Nakhon Basin for the north where Ban Chang is. So we couldn't tell the difference between these individuals, even if they did move in. So there are some issues with using isotopes to assess this. So I tried as well to look at genetic affinity to see whether there had been any evidence of population replacement when you add more evidence to the bucket. And just adding to the craniometric work, which had already been done, I looked at three-dimensional metrics, which is geometric morphometrics, to find essentially the same thing, but there's no difference in terms of cranial shape between the flex burials and the Neolithic and Bronze Age. So the flexed are in yellow there, the Neolithic are in red, and the green are the Bronze Age. So the flex burials fall well within the norm for this site in general. And then I added non-metric traits to see whether the non-metrics showed that there were any differences. And in terms of non-metric traits, when you correct for sample size biases, again, there's no statistically significant differences between the flex burials and our supine burials. So, what does all this mean in terms of all our models? Well, actually, it makes it a little bit more confusing because most of the flex burials do have a different diet to the supine burials at the site, which could be, if you squint a bit, consistent with hunter-gatherer behaviour. But there is no evidence in terms of the isotopes for different places of origin, and there is no evidence for genetic differences between the flexed and the supine burials. So what does all that mean? Well, essentially it means that the differences in burial practice can't be to do with genetic differences. They have to be to do with cultural differences, which might mean something really cool. It is possible that the flex burials are evidence for a retention of hunter-gatherer behaviour despite admixture previously with an agricultural behaviour, an agricultural incoming population, which kind of stands to reason. It would be incredibly lucky if we had excavated at Ban Non Wat the very first evidence for interaction between hunter-gatherers and agriculturalists. And what we might have here is something that correlates with what we see ethnographically in places like the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where you get a symbiotic relationship happening between hunter-gatherers and agriculturalists, providing a more broad spectrum base for the diet. Of course, it is always possible that the isotopes are lying to us, or just not as precise as we would really like them to be. The isotopic ratios that I'm saying could be hunter-gatherer here could also be consistent with millet agriculture or more consumption of domesticated animals which are fed on C4 crops or a mixture of C4 and C3 crops. So they could just be employing a different agricultural strategy. But what I think is pretty clear from combining lots of different lines of evidence at Ban Non Wat is that the Neolithic, or transition, or maybe I shouldn't use that term anymore, but the incoming of agriculture isn't this simple process of rice coming in and everybody just converting to that. There's still a lot of cultural differences and potentially subsistence differences even happening within that with different subsets of the population. And so, kind of as Mark says, on a site-by-site basis, we can look at this and see that things are complicated and we should take that into account when we're building these models. And that, I think, is me. Thanks, everyone.
Very much, Charlotte. Cool. Any questions for Charlotte? We've got a few minutes. Mark?
No, it just made me think of looking at those flex burials again at the Mumbuk site. We had 2 flexed burials amongst all the other supine burials. Cool. And Mumbuk, but Mumbuk was different from this site in that there was clear evidence for
different populations.
Yeah, different genetic phenotypic groups going on. But there was still a retention of some flexed forms of burial, even though some of the individuals who were clearly indigenous, use that term, had adopted all of the so-called Neolithic cultural practices. But there was still residual use of flexed here as well. So.
Awesome, I didn't know about that. That's really
I just forgot all about it. Yeah.
Cool. Any other questions for Charlotte? Sila, isn't it?
Oh, yeah.
Sila.
Yep.
Thought it was Rasmi or Sila.
Is this? Oh yeah, thank you. That was a very nice talk. I'm just kind of curious about this idea, especially with the millet, and sort of these C4 signatures for those burials. And I'm not very familiar with the human isotopic record, especially from places like China, where maybe you might expect to find this type of signature. But do you know? Are there, even in agricultural communities, are there clearly defined differences that you can sparse out isotopically between those groups?
I guess in most agricultural communities, everybody is adhering to the same sort of subsistence strategy. So normally there isn't one group who's massively off to the side, unless there are sort of status differences involving that or something cultural getting in on that. To me, it's not beyond the realms of possibility that there would be millet farmers, particularly in early levels of Ban Non Wat, because in the more southern Kawampuchan Valley, we have millet preceding rice in those areas. And so it's not completely out there to assume that some people might have been using that. But it is weird to find them contemporary with other people who are definitely using rice as one of their main things.
Rasami?
I just wonder that it is interesting to see the flag bearer and supply bearer. Have you looked at the brave good that, when you say it's probably different culture, you find any difference in terms of brave goods or animal offering or, things like that?
Well, I haven't done the grave good analysis, that's Charles Hyman's area, but the grave goods are quite different. There are ceramic forms that don't exist in the supine burials. There are some shell forms, shell species that don't exist within the supine burials, and the supine burial mortuary offerings don't tend to cross over, like they don't have the same sorts of things as with the flex hunter-gatherers. Well, not hunter-gatherers, the flex ones.
Also, do you plan to do the DNA analysis?
Ban Non Wat doesn't have any collagen preserved, which means we can't do DNA analysis there. It would be so great if we could, and I think that people keep on trying, but yeah. No worries.
Any other questions for Charlotte? Okay, if you'd like to join me in thanking her again.